In the current climate of U.S. politics, it seems almost unbelievable that it's been barely 2 months since the first black president of the United States concluded his second term in office. But the question of race in America is as old as the nation itself. And so, as animosity and suspicion continue to bedevil relations between white and black Americans, academic, writer, and activist Michael Eric Dyson offers a powerfully blunt diagnosis of what ails his country in his new book. It's called Tears We Cannot Stop, a sermon to white America. Michael Eric Dyson is a professor of sociology at Georgetown University, author of 19 books, and an ordained Baptist minister. And we are pleased to welcome him to our studio tonight. It is a delight to have you here.
Thank you, my friend. It's great to be here.
You know, I kind of misspoke there, actually. I should say it's a delight to welcome you back here. There is no reason why you should or would remember this, but you were in this studio, it looked a lot different, 20 years ago, having a debate with Dinesh D'Souza about the nature of race relations in America.
Yeah, that's been a minute. Yeah.
You want to see what you looked like in your mid-30s?
I certainly do.
Okay.
It's horrifying.
Sheldon, let's roll the clip, please.
What are those cultural strategies that successful groups like the Koreans are pursuing that inner city blacks are not pursuing? It's not a matter of moral superiority, it's a matter of functional superiority.
Is there something about the experience that new immigrants to the United States have that differs so dramatically from the black experience that blacks are not able to replicate it?
Certainly. There's a whole history of legacy of slavery. For 2.5 centuries, African Americans were prohibited from even being included within the larger circle of American privilege, economically, politically, and educationally.
That hasn't been the case for 70 years.
Oh, of course, but we're talking about, you see, but that's been the case for white European ethnics and immigrants who come over on America. The first thing that they learned was that they were not black, a kind of via negativa of their own cultural assimilationist ideology and identity. So in other words, they learned that whatever they were in whatever country they came from, when they came to America, they weren't black.
And that still resonates today for black people?
Of course it continues to resonate for black people, because it's not simply of what happened then, it's how it extends itself now. Can we believe, honestly, that as historians say, we certainly live in the United States of amnesia? Can we honestly believe that 2.5 centuries can be wiped out by 30 years of, say, affirmative action? And Mr. D'Souza and I have debated before about affirmative action.
Shall we pick up on our conversation from 20 years ago?
My goodness, it's a good place to start.
Okay. In those 20 years, you have had a black president for 12 of them. I'm being a little facetious here.
Right,
Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, okay?
Of course.
And yet, to read your book, which I have done, it is to conclude that race relations are really no better today than they were 20 years ago, and making matters worse, Donald Trump is now your president.
Right.
Can it be true, in your view, that so little progress has been made since we taped that 20 years ago?
There's no question that there's been extraordinary progress on the one hand, but tokened in and gestured by Barack Obama's ascent to the presidency. The most powerful man in the world, as the occupant of that office is known. So there's no question that that has been an extraordinary achievement and an event in African American and indeed in American and indeed world history. On the other hand, there's the persistence of the lethargy of a criminal justice system that continues to disproportionately incarcerate African American and Latino men and women. There's the fact that black kids and brown kids and Native kids are expelled at an earlier age and at a far higher rate than their white counterparts. They are disciplined far more harshly, and they are stigmatized in many ways. Retail profiling in terms of going into a store and being tracked and followed and the like. So when you add this up, the accumulation of the educational disparities that continue to dog and, if you will, betray the American ideals and dreams, there is no doubt that there's been a persistence of racial inequality that has really left African American and brown people beleaguered. And as a result of that, racial progress has not kept pace with the ideals and aspirations that we've often put forth and that were signified with the presidency of Barack Obama.
I know you get this question all the time, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You are a guy from Detroit, Michigan.
Yes.
You were born 5 years before Martin Luther King gave that, well, what's probably the greatest speech ever given.
Right.
I mean, we can argue about it, but
right.
why
Yeah,
bother?
no.
It's the I Have a Dream speech. It's certainly the best thing I've ever seen.
Right.
You are now one of the most prolific, renowned professors in all of America, teaching at a great university, Georgetown. Doesn't that say something about the black experience in America today?
Of course it does. It says that there's been tremendous progress. Potential has been realized. Individuals who have been able to succeed is enormous. But in Hitler's Germany, I'm sure that there were Jews who were doing extraordinary work, who were recognized and who were accomplished in a serious way, but who were also vulnerable because of their identity, so that the success of representative figures doesn't negate the fact that there is a tremendous groundswell of difficulty for the masses of African American people, so that my success is not a repudiation of the notion that racial progress has been stalled. The fact that a few of us and many of us have gotten through to become upwardly mobile, to enjoy enormous success and to be acclaimed and to have been celebrated is not to deny that the masses of people continue to face impediments, obstacles, and barriers that prohibit them from flourishing and that keep them from joining what I termed 20 years ago the larger circle of American privilege.
And in fact, your book is a quite harrowing account of some of the things that you have been through in your life, including being pistol whipped by a cop, including being embarrassed in front of one of your kids as you went into a bank to try to be served in a bank.
That's right.
And more. I want you to tell one of the stories, if you would, Michael. One of them was the reaction at your college in Tennessee to having been admitted with a scholarship to Princeton, which you would think is a pretty cool thing. Pick up the story, if you would.
Well, I was accepted into Princeton. The college, Carson Newman, wanted to do a commercial to celebrate and to feed those who were entering into higher education, some into Vanderbilt, great schools, but obviously mine was the only Ivy League school. And so we were going to we made the commercial, but the president of the school wanted to make certain that I had indeed been invited to attend Princeton, a curious caveat. But I went to his office, and when he asked if indeed I had been admitted to Princeton, I whipped out the papers to prove that I had been accepted and been granted a generous fellowship on top of that. To which he replied, you know, son, you don't need to be going to college. You don't need to go to graduate school. What you need to do is get a job and pay back the $7,000 odd that you owe us. And without missing a beat and knowing that he was a clergyman who had not finished a terminal degree at the highest level, I said, well, certainly, Dr. So-and-so, you know what it means to get a PhD. I said, then again, you don't. And then post haste, left his office, never to be invited back to that school for 31 years. But it was a moment that indicated to me that there would be resentment of my success. You know, we would think in America, well, or in Canada or throughout the world, that if you're a minority, if you're part of a tradition that's been marginalized, when you succeed, there would be great acclamation and great celebration. But there was not the case then. And often there's a kind of seething resentment. I think some of Donald Trump's seething resentment of Barack Obama when Barack Obama was president and Trump was a birther, the person who believed in the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was not a true American citizen, expressed some of that seething cauldron of hatred that sometimes spills over at the acknowledgement of the success of a black person.
And for the record, the clergyman president who said that to you, the color of his skin was?
A white man.
Okay, let's just say that for sure. Now, I can't read this. It's from your book, but you can read it.
All right.
So can I ask you to read this?
Absolutely.
Here's an excerpt from your book. Here is how you describe the attitude of some whites to you.
All right.
Board 1, right there.
I cannot pretend that I'm in any way better than the masses of black folk. I know that no matter how much education I've got, how well I behave, how much compassion I show to white folk, how well-heeled I am in polite company, no matter how articulate I am, I'm still just a nigger to so many white folk.
People will now understand why I can't read that.
Of course, yes.
Am I right to be uncomfortable reading that out loud?
Absolutely. You know, many white Americans and many white people throughout the world say, well, wait a minute, it's a word. You people use it among yourselves. You denigrate each other routinely on rap records and in rap videos. Why can we not have access to it? It's an ironic question. On the one hand, I remember Chris Rock appearing on the Oprah Winfrey Show saying that, you know, many white people feel that their lives would be completed if they could just use that term. They could run corporations, they could win the Olympic medal, but my God, being denied the use of the N-word seems to be an ultimate act of betrayal and injustice. But the thing is that white brothers and sisters invented that word. And having invented that word, it was snatched back by black people and others, who, especially African Americans, who wanted to use it as a term of endearment and not derision. The word I just read is not a term of endearment. It is a term of derision. It is one from which black people, that white people in public have been barred, sometimes resentfully, sometimes with a sense of irony and desperation to equal the playing field. But the reality is that these are not equal times, and this is not an equal playing field, and that word continues to conjure such hate, not only because it's spoken as the most hateful word one might imagine toward an ethnic group, an epithet hurled with lethal intensity against vulnerable egos and black bodies. It is accompanied often by acts of lynching, castration, and murder, so that term didn't just have an isolated, if you will, semantic meaning. It was often connected to heinous acts that reinforced the vulnerability of black people.
Would you agree, though, that there is a great deal more cultural sensitivity in North America today to white people using that word?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are barriers imposed, there are sensitivities that are raised, and there's awareness that's been spread.
Did you ever see the movie Blazing Saddles?
Absolutely.
That movie could not get made today, right? Don't you think?
Not at all. It's true. It's true. Yeah.
No, I mean, ironically,
absolutely right.
the hero of the movie obviously is a black
Yes.
sheriff who's way smarter than all the dumb white people around him. But still, the use of the N-word throughout the movie means it almost certainly couldn't be made
Except
today.
if you were Quentin Tarantino.
Well, that's different. Okay,
Right.
good point. You've mentioned Donald Trump. Let's go there. I think many people thought that Obama's victory twice as President of the United States was, in some respects, America's coming to terms with its quote-unquote race problem.
Right.
Do you think his double victory has actually, in effect, exacerbated those problems?
In many ways, the resentment to which I made reference earlier lingers, not only with Donald Trump, but with many white Americans who felt they were being left out of the equation of American justice. This last election was said to be a referendum on the part of working class white people who felt that they were somehow rendered even more invisible, resentful of black people and brown people who, after all, were at least acknowledged, and that they were not. And what's ironic there, of course, is that what Donald Trump tapped into was this groundswell of enormous, resentment against having to share the toys in the sandbox of life, so to speak. Even working class white people who had access to unions that they barred black and brown people from, pipe fitters and people who were, automobile workers. There was tremendous tension between, burgeoning classes and upwardly mobile classes. And as a result of that, the internecine squabbles between white and black working class and classes were real. So that people have tried to romanticize white working class people as a kind of paragon of virtue, when indeed they are implicated in the very racist practices of American government, but they've also been unfairly treated as a result of economic inequality. And to believe that Donald Trump could become a blue-collar billionaire who would treat them with, a great sense of justice was a pipe dream to begin with. And now that he's in office, for the 2 months he's been there, and putting forth a budget that slashes social programs that, ironically enough, help them, and even Obamacare. Some of the people who voted against the Democratic representative for the party that is running for the presidency, Hillary Clinton, and voted instead for Donald Trump, now feel the razor's edge of their own contradictory behavior, believing that this man could tap into their white resentment, but that white resentment would not serve them politically. Martin Luther King Jr., since you referred to him, was in jail in Birmingham, Alabama, and his white warden and jailer came to him and said, "You know what, Dr. King, you're wrong. Segregation is right." He said, "No, it's not." And then he asked him, he said, "How much money do you make? What's your standard of living?" And when he told him, he says, "My God, you should be," in his book, "you should be out there marching with us as well." So King understood we've got more in common as working class white and black people than we have with anybody else, especially the overlords and the captains of industry who, if you will, make a misery of all of our lives together.
You referred to it, though, as racism there, a racism that turned many people away from the Obama legacy towards Donald Trump.
Sure.
And I want to understand better whether it's racism or xenophobia. I don't think they're the same thing.
They're not the same thing. Xenophobia is the intolerance of the other coming into your country, the Mexicans that Donald Trump talked about, but he also went after. I think there's a distinctly racial element to hating the first black president and then claiming his illegitimacy predicated upon some litmus tests that were not evoked with, say, John McCain and others who were questionable in their national origin.
But isn't that xenophobia rather than racism?
Well, no, it could be both. They could converge, right? You could be xenophobic against a particular kind of other that comes in who happens to be black. But in this case, it was specifically racism because it's not simply the fact that that Barack Obama might have been another, that is, from another nation. He was a black figure who had gained a certain legitimacy, and as a result of that, the blackness itself occasioned a resentment, and the reason for it became conveniently, well, he's not an American citizen.
Okay. Can we acknowledge that when Barack Obama gave that speech saying there is no white America, there is no black America, there is no Latino America, there is no Asian America, there are only the United States of America, that not quite?
Yeah. I won't accuse him of having experimented with the drugs he said he left behind long ago. But I will suggest that there was the inhaling of a kind of, victorious Americanism, a kind of celebration of American empire and its virtue. And one of its virtues was the ability to overcome those differences. Barack Obama was obviously wrong when he said it. I wrote a book on him and the issue of race. And he was saying that, and black people who knew better knew that he was saying it because he had to say it, that in America, white brothers and sisters who heard that would be enchanted and enticed to his side. It is not that he believed that he was wrong. It is the fact that he was too optimistic in his estimation that we had transcended those bilious differences and those hateful, acrimonious separations that had marked America's progress toward true democracy, that continues to mark its progress toward true democracy. So Obama was overestimating. And ironically enough, he continued to do so for most of his time in office, and that set up the gulf, the lacuna, the abyss, the real vacuum that Donald Trump occupied. The irony is Barack Obama's inability to speak about race, or his loathsome approach to talking about race, left a vacuum that Donald Trump had no regrets and no chagrin about speaking into. And as a result of that, he seized the day and won it in one sense because of his interpretation of race, which was far darker, far less sanguine, far less, if you will, celebratory of the American spirit than was Barack Obama's.
You've met President Obama, obviously.
Yes, I have.
And spoken with him about these issues, I presume.
I certainly have.
Does he share your interpretation of his presidency?
No, I think that he believes that he did what he had to do, that he felt that a rising tide would lift all boats, that if we talked about America, the great America that was part of a larger tradition in the world of moving toward justice, and in our own country, in America, the imperfect experiment of democratic energy, he felt that, hey, we were doing the right thing by speaking that way. And I said to him, sir, I just disagree with that. He also believed that you shouldn't target black and brown and red and yellow communities, that you should put forth a universal conception of what is good for the democracy, and black and brown and red and yellow people would be brought along. Well, if that's the case, the Declaration of Independence was good enough then, or the Constitution. If universalism worked, those documents were far more significant, central, and no disrespect to him, more eloquent than anything he might be able to author. And yet at the same time, because it didn't work, the civil rights movement rose up to defend the principles that were articulated by the Declaration of Independence and made sure that they would be applied to African American people.
In which case, of the two black presidents America has had,
Right.
I'm being a little facetious here, Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, who was actually better at the end of the day for African Americans?
Well, that's an interesting question. Now, given the kind of revised history of the Clinton years, enormous economic prosperity for most Americans, and an attempt to deal with the issue of race head on. But the consequences of a draconian measure of criminal justice, the 3 strikes and you're out, the exponential increase in the incarceration of African American people, all ascribed to Bill Clinton's attempt to demonize and criminalize those who were exploiting and engaging in offensive behavior around crack cocaine. So the irony is the first black president, metaphorically Bill Clinton, embraced African American people straightforwardly, put a lot of people in his cabinet and the like, but also gave forth to policies, signing welfare reform, the crime bill that had a deleterious and pernicious impact upon African American people, and put a lot of folk in jail and put a lot of folk behind bars, and then rendered them incapable of protecting themselves, and the safety net being shredded, and as a result of that, couldn't provide for their families. So in that sense, he was kind of tough. Barack Obama seemed to be far better, and yet at the end of the day, the unemployment of black people shot up to something like 16% under Barack Obama. Had he been a white man, it is safe to say that many black people who supported Obama would have been marching around the White House saying, "What are you doing?" And Obama for instance, refused to meet frequently with the Congressional Black Caucus. Donald Trump is about to meet with them, I believe, in a little while. So when Donald Trump meets with the Congressional Black Caucus, he will have done so far earlier than Barack Obama. It's a smart move in many ways, but it does indicate the complicated situation in which Barack Obama found himself, and I think the poor choices he made in some senses toward African-American people and others while he was in office.
I think you said you think Hillary Clinton actually would have been a better president for the African-American community in the U.S. than Obama.
Oh, without question.
Why do you say?
First of all, because white privilege allows her to do so, right? Barack Obama can't be too black in public because he will be disdained, he will be chagrined. People would keep him at a clinical distance. So Hillary Clinton can say things that Barack Obama could never get away with. Bill Clinton can go on nighttime television and play the saxophone and not be seen stereotypically as a black man. If Barack Obama does that, my God, what are you doing? You're eating watermelon, basically. In other words, engaging in a stereotype. But having said that, Hillary Clinton spoke about white privilege. She talked about implicit bias. She talked about the disproportionate concentration of black people in prison and the like. So she was saying far more progressive things and putting forth policies, or at least policy recommendations, that I think would alleviate those sufferings and those, if you will, offenses that black people endured, because she was willing to say, because you're an African-American person, these are the consequences of the public policies and the practices and behaviors in the nation that bewitch you. Barack Obama was unable and incapable and unwilling to do that. And as a result of his failure, I think many of his public policies did not address as powerfully as they might the issues that black people confronted.
Conversely, here's how you describe Donald Trump. Quote, the literal face of white innocence without consciousness, white privilege without apology. The white privilege without apology I get.
Right.
But white innocence, what are you getting at there?
The refusal to own up to your behavior. Innocent in the fact I'm not guilty. I'm innocent also in the sense that I refuse to grow up. I hate to cast aspersions against the presidency of this man and to engage in ad hominem, but it is indeed the first toddler presidency where a person who is incapable of restraining himself, imposing constraints, toddler in the sense that what he excretes into the diapers is tweeted to the world. And the inability to have deferred gratification and look at a situation and then use your intelligence to estimate what needs to be done. So I think in that sense, the innocence, the refusal to grow up, the refusal to take responsibility, we are embroiled presently with the recognition of the intelligence community and the ranking members in Congress on that committee saying there is no evidence at all that Barack Obama or his administration engaged in spying on Donald Trump.
Is that the craziest thing you ever saw in your life?
And yet he persists in insisting so. So my point is, white Americans can think, that's Donald Trump, that's crazy. No, there's a more organic relationship between Eric Cantor and John Boehner and Mitch McConnell and other Republican leaders, and what we see manifest in Donald Trump today.
President likes you. He does. He said so.
Yeah, he did say so.
He told you to your face. What did he tell you?
He says, you've been very tough on me, but I love you. And if I had your pipes and brains, I'd be president now. I said, Lord, have mercy, Jesus.
He called you one of our best minds.
He did say so. This is while he was running. And look, I have no personal animus against Donald Trump. And in fact, I recognize his charismatic authority, his presence. He took me up and down the aisle of people who were waiting for him, the lines. This is one of the smartest guys and so on. So it's very ingratiating behavior, to be sure, and very charismatic, but it has nothing to do with the political consequences of his behavior in office and the kind of detriment I think he represents, not only to America, but indeed to the world.
Here's another quote from your book. The only way to save our nation, and yes, to save ourselves, is to let go of whiteness and the vision of American history it supports.
Right.
Meaning what?
Well, I'm saying that, look, whiteness is we say in the academy, in jargon, a social construction. What the heck does that mean? That means you're not born with it. You're not born with knowing what white or black or brown or yellow is, or being born a particular ethnicity. You're born as a human being, and yet the society in which we live tells us that these are heritable characteristics that should be passed on and transmitted, not just physical, but mental and moral and social ones. So now we begin to fill in the blanks about what it means to be black or white or red or yellow, and we begin to tell people and cultures that these things are important and these things are not. Some people are smarter, some people are not. And so we began to ascribe to them characteristics that cannot be biologically determined. Anthropologists have told us in a heterosexual paradigm that the great litmus test to be evoked to determine if you're part of the same race is if you can mate and have children. Well, that's the case, then we all can as human beings. And so race has already been a social artifice that has been created for the purposes of, enhancing the situation of one and not the other. And I think white people who have invested in that whiteness, especially those who don't even know they're white. When white people hear race, it's like men hearing the word gender. We go, oh yeah, those women and so on. Well, guy, you have a gender too. You have a masculinity that, as the theorists say, is often toxic, feminists tell us. So white people think, oh yeah, red, black, brown, yellow, those are, yeah, whiteness is a construction as well.
We think it's the default condition.
It's a default condition, it's an invisible one, and therefore it's seen as the universal. Canadian, stop trying to be everything else. Don't have a hyphen, just be a straight up Canadian. Don't be a person from London, be a British citizen. Don't just be from Pakistan and what that means, or an African American. Stop putting the hyphen in. And yet the default position of universality suggests that white people don't even recognize the ethnic origins, or sometimes they may recognize the ethnic origins, but not the racial origins, because ethnicity is remade in the crucible of race. You can be Polish, Irish, Italian, Jewish, but in the crucible of race, it's remade into a whiteness. Because, people don't go around, they do sometimes, are you Jewish or Polish or Italian? I can't figure out, what are you? They know you're white. And that whiteness has signified a certain kind of privilege, a certain kind of possibility that others who are excluded from it don't enjoy.
You know Chris Rock's great line about that, right?
What does he say?
Chris Rock, who says something like, we don't hate the Jews.
Right.
We hate all white people.
Well, it was James Baldwin who said that the problems black people had in Harlem because of white landlords who happen to be Jewish, he said, they don't hate you because you're Jewish, they hate you because you're white.
Exactly. There are a few things I love more in this life, Professor, than baseball. So I loved this quote, and it really made me open my eyes in a way that I hadn't before. Sheldon, let's bring this one up, shall we? You never stop to think how the history of whiteness in America is one long scroll of affirmative action. You never stop to think that Babe Ruth never had to play against the greatest players of his generation, just the greatest white players. White privilege is a self-selecting tool that keeps you from having to compete against the best. Is racism a fear of competition?
In some levels it is, of course. And you prevent that competition from the very beginning, and you convince yourself that you are the best because you don't have to compete against those that are potentially greater than you. Now, initially, you're not even conscious of that. Oh my God, you're so manifestly inferior. You would never be able to think with us, play with us, hit with us. So when you think about it, in America, the first black player to play for the National Basketball Association just died last year. That's mind-boggling. The first. That meant that before his entree into the NBA, no black person could play. Can we think of a sport like basketball, which is now, 85% African-American? You got some Eastern Europeans coming in and some good Canadian players like Andrew Wiggins. But the reality is that it's a black man's game. So when white people had dominated that game, they were not dominating because of talent. They were dominating because the rules were rigged to keep them from playing. It was a fix in. So Donald Trump is right about that. The fix is in, all right, but it's for whiteness, not against it.
Whiteness has privilege and power connected to it, no matter how poor you are. So you say.
Right.
This is going to be a very hard sell for the 50-something coal miner in West Virginia, whose complete life has been turned upside down and whose livelihood has disappeared, and who may very well have an opioid addiction as a result of it all.
Absolutely.
Would you agree that's a tough sell?
Absolutely. And not only that, I am empathetic to that situation, the situation of that particular coal miner. But privilege is always relative. And what I meant by privilege is not that they have money in the bank, that they drive a nice car and live in a nice neighborhood and don't have black lung disease and don't die earlier than they ought. What I'm suggesting is that if that same white miner is going down the street in West Virginia or happens to have a trip to Washington, D.C., or other parts, south or north, east or west, and then encounters a law enforcement, that there will not be an automatic presumption that he is a danger to his society, a menace to our own culture, and as a result of that, be treated with such utter disposability and dispatch that he is seen to be a potential, if you will, murderer and then shot, looking the wrong way, speaking the wrong way. The way routinely black people are, no matter their economic situation, No matter how rich they are and how much money they have, you could at any point be arbitrarily if you will, targeted by a police person, and you could lose your life. I've had conversations with the former Attorney General of the United States of America, Eric Holder, who said ultimately the first black AG didn't know what to tell his own son in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin. You put your hands up, you get shot. You put your hands down, you get shot. You run, you get shot. You don't run, you get shot. You sass the police, you get shot. You remain silent, you get shot. So that white coal miner without any money in the bank at least has the ability to trade in his white skin as a protection, as a prophylactic socially against the distress and sometimes the murder to which other black and brown people are routinely subjected.
You referred to a story in the book which was incredibly troubling of how scared you are on a regular basis. You have 3 children.
Yes, right.
And one of your kids was pulled over by a cop.
That's right.
You want to tell the story and what happened next?
Yeah, my son, who's an anesthesiologist in New York City, with his son, my grandson, Mosi, and was stopped for some kind of petty offense. And
well, he picked up his smartphone, which had fallen off the dashboard.
That's right, it's fallen off the dashboard. The light probably indicated that the policeman to him that he was reading his phone, and you shouldn't be reading your phone and looking at your phone and driving. So my son tried to explain to him time and time again, that's not what happened. And the policeman was insisting that his version of the story is indeed what happened, and grew increasingly aggressive. And my grandson in the back seat was getting increasingly fearful. And my son was saying to himself, I just don't want to get shot in front of my son tonight. And no matter how much deference you display, no matter how much willingness you are, how much you are willing to abdicate your own authority as a human being and as a man, and say in the face of this authority, look, it's your way, I'm not going to argue with you. There is the real fear that that will not be enough, that his insatiable thirst for dominance will lead even to the death of a young black anesthesiologist with his son in the back seat.
And that is nothing any white North American can understand or experience.
Not routinely. I mean, it's not that it doesn't happen from time to time, but not routinely.
And yet, Atlantic Monthly, a survey, numbers on the differing levels of optimism in your country. The question was, do you believe America's best days are still ahead of it? Sheldon, let's bring these numbers up. You have done so. Thank you. 48% of whites agree America's best days are still ahead of it.
Right.
But 63% of Latinos and Hispanics, 73% of Asians, and 80% of African Americans, the largest group surveyed, says America's best days are still ahead of it. Are you out of touch with your own community?
Aren't we a great people? Aren't we remarkable? Despite the hate and the bile and the disrespect and the grand schemes to maintain and preserve us, that we are the best Americans because we believe deeply in the American dream. We articulate it in a way that many other people can't even hear it. I think it was the Reverend Al Sharpton said once that he was listening to Ray Charles sing about America the Great. He's singing about something he can't even see. He can't even physically visualize what's going on, but he sings with such ardor and such power and such emotional intensity because he believes in that dream even more so than the persons who foisted it upon him. So I think that what that suggests is that African American people are undeniable. They are irrefutable in their American belief, and that regardless of the empirically verifiable impediments to which they are subject, they are willing to believe that America can still become a greater nation and can still live out its dream without being arrogant and without celebrating my own tribe. I got to say I love black people.
Did Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believe that? Did Barack Obama believe that? Do you believe that?
I do believe that our days our best days can be ahead of us, but we have to work for it. James Baldwin said, we have to work for it. Martin Luther King Jr. at the end of his life said, I'm ashamed to say, I'm sorry to conclude that most Americans are unconscious racists. That was not the I Have a Dream speech, because he gave more than one speech. He had more than one hit record. And that other record that he put forth the night before he died, he said, America, all I ask is be true to what you said on paper. So he says, close the gulf between the ideal and the reality, as T.S. Eliot would say in that tremendous poem. So yes, I do believe that as well, but we have to put forth hard work. We have to make America be what it is, not make America great again, hearkening back to some nostalgic past through the tinted rose-colored lenses that celebrated whiteness without apology. Make America great for the first time in the way that it could be. As the great poet Langston Hughes said, America never was America to me, but let America be America again. That's what we're pushing for.
I wonder, though, whether or not there is a concern among you. Let me read this. We haven't, sorry, I'm pulling an audible here. I didn't tell you guys I was going to do this.
All right.
We do not hate you, white America. We hate that you terrorize us and then lie about it and then make us feel crazy for having to explain to you how crazy it makes us feel.
Right.
We cannot hate you, not really, not most of us. That is our gift to you. We cannot halt you. That is our curse.
Right.
Why can't you halt white America?
Because you can't make white Americans believe that you're human. There's nothing we can do to convince it. All of the great roll call of black people who have existed have not been able to convince the masses of Americans who disbelieve in our essential humanity that we are human. Nothing we can do can convince people who disbelieve that we are human to invest in us in a different fashion. You know, in the Bible I read, in the book of Hebrews, it says, those who come to God must believe God is. In other words, you got to give and take. You got to bring something to the table to be open. As William James said, open up a credit of belief. And so many white Americans do not believe in our humanity, have been taught differently and otherwise. And so we can't halt a police person who, if it were his uncle or his aunt or his grandfather or his cousin or his brother, would not treat that person the same way. If you're a white cop in a hair trigger response, and that hair trigger response can determine whether somebody lives or dies, to say, you know what, I'm going to let you go. Or, you know, you're not threatening me that way. Or just because you raise your voice doesn't mean you're a menace to society who deserves to die. Those things are conditioned unconsciously, implicit bias. By the way, that black and brown people share as well. Because when you live in a culture where you're taught that your life is not worth much, where black lives do not matter, then you internalize some of that poison as well. So this is what I mean by we can't halt you. We can't keep you from killing us. We can't keep you from desiring to treat us differently. We know that people get jobs not simply by ads in a paper that are answered. Hey, Steve, my son graduated on Friday from McGill. Good. Tell him to come see me on Thursday. And, you know, and then by Friday he has a job the next week. So things are happening through informal networks that allow people to engage with each other and to understand who they are. And people treat people based upon how they feel intimate with them. I'll end by saying this. There's a woman who directs a business school at Rutgers University who wrote a book, The New American Dilemma. She said it's not so much the bad things that white people do against other people that might be of consequence. It's the good things they do for each other and help each other out, jobs and employment and school situations, classroom appointments that allow them to assist each other in ways they don't pay attention to others. So many white people are born on third base and think they hit a triple, as it is said. And I think that's the kind of thing, the unconscious privilege. Oh, my father only gave me $14 million, Donald Trump says. I'm a self-made man. Yeah, well, with $14 million in the bank, I could be a self-made man, too.
Professor Dyson, this I could talk to you forever. This has been a
brother.
great pleasure. This is called Tears We Cannot Stop. And I have to say, this sermon to white America is not just an analysis of the problem. It does offer a prescription in the last couple of chapters of what white America can do to repair the damage. And it's certainly worth your time to read this. We should not wait 20 years before we do this again.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much for being here.
Appreciate you for having me.
Enjoyed it so much.
Right. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.